Welcome to APPA's third Town Hall of 2021. My name is Billy Zydick, Manager of Special Projects for APPA. Allow me to review a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. All attendees are in listen-only mode. We ask that you utilize the chat box for the Q&A segment of this session. While we attempt to respond to all questions submitted, should we run out of time, responses will be sent to responses will be posted to APPA's COVID-19 RAQ, recently asked question webpage. We also remind participants to ensure their speaker volume level is set for your comfort. Our speakers are gathering us from across the continent, and as such, varying volumes will be present. Today's session will award professional continuing education credits, APPA credential points, and AIA CLUs. For AIA certificates, please email Billy at Billie, B-I-L-L-I-E, at appa.org, along with your AIA membership number if you have not done so in the past. Our webinar recording will be posted to the APPA website later this afternoon. Additionally, you will receive a follow-up email within 72 hours regarding designated links to all webinar recordings, presentation slides, as well as information on the upcoming webinars and town hall. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Lander Medlin, APPA's Executive Vice President and your moderator for today. Lander, take it away.
Thank you, Billy. Thank you, Suzanne, and our panel. Welcome all attendees. We appreciate your engagement in these town hall meetings as we further explore the impact of our facilities organizations on the education enterprise. Just a heads up that we are organizing another town hall for the middle of June, focused on changing fall reopening strategies. More to come. As always, I want to thank you for joining the dialogue. That's what makes this a rich conversation and the special community that we share. Coming full circle from this pandemic and with the latest guidance from the CDC on COVID-19 variants, aerosolized particles, vaccinations, masking, and the like, we are indeed faced with a mixed bag of good news and added confusion for educational facilities professionals. That's why we chose this topic today, the practical realities of COVID and your HVAC systems. It's also why we chose this broad-based panel of experts who will provide their background, expertise, and perspectives as we explore the path forward for our facilities and institutions as a whole. Now, as such, here's the format for today's town hall. I will briefly introduce our topical issue. I'm going to recognize our stellar panel of experts. We'll provide you an ample opportunity for your questions, and then we'll conclude by highlighting just a few additional resources and some closing remarks, very short. The disruption to higher education in K-12 and preparatory schools by this pandemic has eclipsed all our prior experiences. Now we have some added chaos and confusion with the latest relaxed masking and social distancing requirements for people fully vaccinated, vaccine approval for kids, among other announcements. Now, given the lack of universal requirements, what portends for air filtration, ventilation, and cleanliness overall? This continues to beg the question, is my building safe? Increasing our collective knowledge and understanding on this respiratory pathogen and ways to best manage our HVAC systems and proactive response remains critical, yet it's driving more and more questions. So let's get right at it. Today, we have the awesome opportunity to hear from 4 expert panelists who will provide a variety of perspectives on the practical realities of COVID and its impact on you and your HVAC systems. They will address the latest CDC guidance on pathogens, building indoor air quality, and the management of aerosolized particles, especially given the limitations of filtration and ventilation within existing building HVAC systems and the need for proactive communications with your stakeholders. Let me now introduce our first panelist. That happens to be Linda Dickey, RN, MPH, CIC, CPHQ, FAPIC, newly established CEO and consultant, and formerly Senior Director of Epidemiology and Infection at UCI Health, and 2022's President-elect for APPA, the Association for Professionals in Infection Control and Epidemiology. Linda's background includes serving on the Facilities Guidelines Institute, FGI Committee, to develop design criteria for healthcare facilities. She has also taught for over 15 years for the American Society for Healthcare Engineering, ASHE, in courses related to healthcare design, construction, and water management, and has served on the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, ASHRAE 188 committee to establish the standard for Legionella management. Linda's clinical experience is in adult critical care and over 25 years of experience in epidemiology and infection prevention and quality patient safety. She earned a nursing degree from the University of South Carolina and her master's in public health from the University of South Florida. Linda, please help us understand what we need to know about these pathogens. Linda?
Well, good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're calling in from. And I appreciate being included in this panel today, Lance. You know, this is an unprecedented time for infection preventionists. This has been an amazing time to be in our field. And the COVID virus itself has been a fascinating foe, if you will, for all of us in infection prevention, and certainly those of you who are partners in trying to create safe spaces for whatever type of business or life we lead in space. I will say at the top of our discussion, even though that today's discussion is focused on HVAC management, the thing that we know going forward is to achieve success, whether it's in an educational setting or any other type of setting, is that vaccination is our real key to success. So we will certainly talk today about various strategies the CDC has provided based on evidence and their best guidance. But we do know that that promoting vaccination is the one best thing that we can all do to make sure that we're successful in our setting. So taking a step back from that, one of the things that we as epidemiologists and infection preventionists are able to gladly see in the data is that the incidence of COVID does not seem to be very high among children ages 5 to 17. Certainly, there have been some deaths, a small number, and there have been some severe illness, but by and large, the children that have gotten sick with COVID have not suffered with severe illness. And we have seen outbreaks in school settings and educational settings, but a lot of that has been associated with either lack of adherence to policies and processes that were put in place, or actual prevention strategies that might not have been implemented for one reason or another. Interestingly, early on in COVID, there was so much fear and concern about the airborne spread of COVID. And in healthcare settings, which is where my background is, that obviously was a great concern given the concentration of COVID patients that we were seeing. But the evidence of spread has been mainly between people that are close together, generally through close droplets. That's not to say that we haven't been able to see live virus in air particles, and we can talk a little bit about that. But thankfully, we have not seen any evidence of COVID spread through HVAC systems, for example. But having said that, we still want to make sure that we manage our HVAC systems so that the air in our existing spaces is as fresh as possible and augments our other strategies for prevention. Interestingly, in educational settings, the data that we've seen has suggested that most of the spread has been from staff member to staff member and not necessarily from students to staff or from staff to students. And we saw the same thing in healthcare settings. The healthcare providers wear a lot of personal protective equipment or PPE when they're caring for patients. And understandably, their concern was that they would get COVID from their patients. But when they would take a break or when they would carpool or do something with one another, that's when we actually started seeing clusters among our healthcare workers, when they had get-togethers outside of work or would congregate together in eating break rooms. And it looks like the data might be similar for educational facilities, that the staff may, in fact, feel more comfortable around one another and may not necessarily take the same level of precaution earlier in the pandemic. But we've now learned a lot and we're further down the road. So I would imagine that, again, together with the vaccine and individuals adhering to precautions, we've seen a nice decline in our number of cases across the country. The CDC has promoted 5 key prevention strategies for educational settings. The cornerstone around that originally was masking, and of course we realized that across the community settings, that using a mask consistently and correctly is an effective barrier against spreading COVID, as long as it's a good mask that fits well on your face. Physical distancing, we all know about that as well. Definitely is an effective strategy, and that was also a recommendation for educational settings, as well as hand hygiene and respiratory etiquette. And certainly cleaning of surfaces, although we did realize as we got further into the pandemic that contact spread, and again, distance spread through the air were not as strong of components of transmission as certainly closer contact with one another would show itself to be. And then the last component, which I think we've all experienced to some level or another, is contact tracing and isolation and quarantine. We've all been in situations where we've had to screen ourselves for symptoms, make sure that we're not coming to work sick. COVID has been very tricky in that it doesn't always present itself with clear symptoms or very mild symptoms. A very small percentage actually may have no symptoms at all, although our experience at UC Irvine Health was that it was more very mild illness that people might not even recognize as COVID, something as mild as a runny nose. So, all of those strategies are those that were recommended for educational settings, with the #1 strategy being vaccination now in our corner. So I will stop there and move on to the next panelist, and hopefully can contribute to some Q&A later in the morning. And I'll turn it back to you.
Lander, if you could come off mute for us, that would be great.
Yep. We will definitely, thank you so much, Linda, and we will definitely be coming back to you with questions given the background and expertise that you bring to this panel, and the things that we're finding, or the real-time application of all of this at our institutions. I think that's going to be important, so thank you. Let me go to Aaron Lapsley. He's a PE, RESET, Air AP, and Lead AP. Founder and principal of System 2. He was formerly co-creator and head of digital buildings practice for Cushman & Wakefield. Aaron was an original team member of Google's Digital Buildings project. He served as vice president of services and product for Switch Automation, developed and implemented smart building programs for Taubman, Forest City, Glenshire, and other commercial real estate portfolios, a management consultant working primarily in corporate real estate transformation for Deloitte Consulting, and a mechanical design engineer in New York. Aaron holds an MBA from Harvard Business School and his BS in mechanical engineering, University of Oklahoma. Aaron, please share your knowledge on HVAC ventilation relative to pathogen transmission and building indoor air quality. Aaron?
Thank you, Lander. Really appreciate the intro. Thanks for taking the time with me today. I have a few slides to run through here, so I think I'll just notify to move forward in the deck. I've been focused on indoor air quality as a topic going back to before the pandemic. My focus for about the last 8 years has been in building technology, and particularly in building performance using data. So what I want to talk today about is a data-driven approach to indoor air quality. I think historically what indoor air quality was to a lot of people is what we would call occupant comfort, and it was the right side of the Venn diagram. It's environmental factors. It's largely based around the types of things that you can measure with sensors. So there's a standard out there called RESET. If you don't know that, I don't have time to go into it now, but if you don't know it, have a look. It's interesting. It's a data-based performance verification standard for building certification. And it's also certification for technology. The 5 variables that they indicate in their certification for a monitor, an IAQ monitor to measure, are temperature, relative humidity, CO2, total VOCs, and particulate matter, particularly PM 2.5. We call those like the IAQ 5. That's kind of the standard things you measure for environmental conditions. But the pandemic has really taught us that IAQ is 2 things. There's this issue around pathogens. That's more around health and safety. It's more around discrete transmission events most of the time. There are some cases where you can get very sick to longer term exposure from things like mold. But generally speaking, with viruses, we're talking about transmission events. And instead of monitoring, you have to think about air testing. So I'll talk about some of the work I'm doing with a company that's actually allowing us to do interesting air testing for ventilation. Next slide, please. A data-driven approach to IAQ is focused around what I've come up with as 5 goals that are listed here. So it's around monitoring and improving indoor air quality and ventilation systems, also measuring and reducing pathogen transmission and illness risk. Also keeping a focus on sustainability. The thing that's important here is, we are also in a crunch right now around energy and carbon, and we have to keep in mind that there can be trade-offs and costs and actually IAQ impacts too through outdoor air from increased energy consumption. Increasingly, we're seeing in the commercial space a desire to demonstrate success in leadership certification of spaces, thinking back to like LEED, but looking more at performance-based certifications like RESET and Air Rated that actually look at data. And then I think maybe most important for all of us, directing investment to the highest value opportunities and solutions. So what do we need to do those things? Well, we need data to be able to measure, monitor, and verify the interventions we're going to make for IAQ. I want to talk through just a couple of quick case studies about what data has taught me about IAQ in building spaces. Next slide, please. So with a commercial airflow monitor, this technology has come a long way in the last 5 years, incidentally, and IoT style solutions for indoor air quality sensors are very viable now and cost effective. It's one of the reasons this has become a hot topic for me over the last few years. This is data from when I had one in my office as we were evaluating different solutions back when I was at Cushman & Wakefield. And what you see in the spike of the teal colored line there is CO2. That's CO2 on occupied days. The reason that spiked, by the way, is because the HVAC at this building did not turn on until 8:30 in the morning. We occupied this space, a number of people, at 8 o'clock in the morning pretty consistently, and I would often come in and be on the phone. It was in Pacific time. I was talking to my colleagues on the East Coast, would start early, close the door so I wouldn't bug other people. And what you get when you don't have ventilation in a space is an extremely rapid deterioration in indoor air quality. So within about a 15-minute time span, you go from close to ambient levels, background levels, around 500 parts per million in this building, to well over 900 parts per million. Now that's not toxic, it's not a huge issue. Might be some cognitive performance effects of that, but it shows you how quickly that it can deteriorate. And when it comes to pathogen transmission risk, a very good proxy for how well a building is ventilating is CO2, because it's a thing that we all emit while we are breathing and at a fairly consistent rate. So if you have to monitor one thing in order to get data on risk, at least look at your CO2. how can you sort of combat this kind of problem where the HVAC isn't running when it should? Well, there's some information that's very interesting from Schneider Electric indicating that over a 3-year period, as they integrated HVAC systems into their fault detection diagnostic analytic platform called Building Advisor, that 36% by count of units were functioning with a fault. So you were talking like a third of pieces of mechanical equipment across a significant hundreds of millions of square feet were operating in a fault condition. Most of them by count were terminal units. So VAV boxes, things out at the edge of the distribution network that directly affects ventilation to occupied spaces. So analytics can be very, very powerful. Next slide, please. Another tool that we have in our arsenal here is starting to think about CO2 level zone control for HVAC. And while this usually requires reheat and therefore there are some energy code considerations, this is an example from a building that used the whole building performance method to comply with ASHRAE 90.1 energy code and Title 24 in California, where the energy code is very strict. It's a super efficient building. It's got solar on the roof. You know, they were able to actually verify the whole building is efficient. Every occupied zone has reheat and CO2 zone level control. It is extremely effective at maintaining effective ventilation. So it's a little finicky. CO2 responds more quickly to occupancy than temperature does because we're all breathing it out. So it is a little more difficult to tune, but even a poorly performing zone only had a maximum reading of about 1,300 parts per million, which is really quite good. There's a lot of office spaces that get that high out there without similar environments. Multi-occupancy conference rooms is the data you're looking at here, and there were 29 in this building. So it's not bad that even a zone operating with an improperly tuned VAV and box only hit about 1,300 parts per million. But to do this, it does require data and care and feeding in the system to keep it tuned up. One more example I want to run through, next slide please, is related to the pathogen testing or health and safety risk testing. There's a company out there now called Safe Traces that actually has the capability to do aerosol testing in real world environments. They have a solution with patented technology that actually is mimicking the fluid that comes out of a human when you cough or talk or sneeze. It is like a saliva biomimic that has DNA tagged particles in it that can then be sampled out of the air or with swabs on surfaces. So this allows you to do a release in a space and then sample over time to determine the sort of dilution or relative concentration and where those particles migrate around. You can sample at multiple points across the floor. This is an example that is fairly close to education. That was a training room in a corporate environment, but it's a large training room, about 100-person nominal occupancy. It's fed by a rooftop unit. They were trying to determine the relative impact of upgrading the filtration in the room, and then also whether or not an in-room HEPA filter was effective at reducing aerosols. The findings were pretty novel here. Is what they found essentially, that somewhat not surprisingly, is a well-sized HEPA filter in the room had a dramatic effect on reducing the infectious aerosol concentration. So it took about 10 minutes quicker to get to the 99.9% reduction level that Safe Traces uses as its sort of benchmark for safety against the baseline. So that's 10 minutes out of 40 minutes for the non-HEPA filter solution. It's about 25% quicker you get there. But what maybe the more novel finding is the MERV 13 filter increase in both scenarios, so with and without the HEPA filter on the floor, had a very negligible effect, essentially unmeasurable effect. Which is really quite interesting. And what this company has seen as they've gone through and done similar testing on recirculating air systems that are actually out at operating buildings across multiple real estate types, K through 12 education, healthcare facilities, corporate and commercial office. And they are consistently finding that not very much infectious aerosol actually makes it back to the air handling unit. I think, Linda, you touched on that. A lot of the HVAC engineering colleagues that I work with have kind of intuitively suspected this, but this has not been really possible to measure. You could simulate it with CFC. You could try, tracer gases, but they're not aerosol particles. They're not liquid aerosol particles. This is actually liquid aerosol particles that mimic the distribution of what happens when a human being sneezes or coughs in a space. And kind of the takeaway at the end of the day is that things are so diluted and go through such a tortuous path that is highly turbulent that almost nothing makes it back even to the upstream side of an air handling unit. And so that goes to say, look, you might want to increase your filtration and your outside air ventilation for the environmental side of IAQ. That makes a lot of sense. If you're in California, you should be thinking about higher filtration because of particulate matter from wildfire smoke and other reasons. Similarly, if you're in a large city somewhere. But if your goal is, and you have a limited budget to spend, is purely to reduce the risk of infectious airborne transmission, you are not likely to get the biggest bang for your buck by upgrading the central air handling unit. Focusing on the effect at the room and occupied zone level is going to get you a significant higher effect. And there's a variety of things to sort of do there, but it's a different story than what you're maybe hearing from some groups out there that have made declarations on this. So I think I'll stop there. I've got one other case study we might touch on if we hit back into Q&A, but you can skip my final two slides. I don't want to take up any more time right now. Thanks, everybody.
That was terrific, Aaron. And I think you're getting on to some of the things that our folks are trying to manage in the midst of all of this. And I know that they will have questions as well. So we're going to have a really good dialogue, I think, here. So let me go to Dave Handwork. Dave is a PE professional engineer, Assistant Vice Chancellor of Facilities, Arkansas State University, and APPA Vice President for Information and Communications. Having worked at ASU in positions of increasing responsibility since 2011, under David's leadership, the campus energy management controls were consolidated under a single system with all new installations and programming managed with a state staff. Accomplished installation of a district chilled water system from scratch, managed over $160 million of new construction and renovations from academic to athletic facilities. David's 26 years of professional experience includes major capital construction management in higher education and food processing, engineering design, and management of multiple teams of professionals. His professional leadership in ASHRAE, APPA, CAPPA, our central region, and other organizations is a testament of commitment to advancing and promoting the field of facilities management. David earned his bachelor's degree in agricultural engineering from Arkansas State University and a master's degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Arkansas. David, please give us your perspective from the facilities owner-manager vantage point, especially with respect to existing buildings. David?
Thank you, Lander, and it's my pleasure to be on here and honored to be with such a distinguished panel to talk through some of these issues related to COVID and HVAC. I want to disclose that because of all of our busy schedules, we couldn't get together and really kind of coordinate what the content we're talking about. And I feel very happy and pleased that, the things I'm going to talk about is really going to complement very well what Linda and Aaron have already spoken upon. I'm really going to focus on the existing buildings and what we need to do about them to make them safe and healthy for our occupants, because we're reoccupying buildings in a lot of part of our country. Some of our buildings have already been reoccupied. So what do we need to do for our existing systems that's been out there, our air handling HVAC systems that may have been in place for 30, 40, and sometimes even more than 40 years, and there's not been really much upgrades to it. So so tagging on to and kind of giving some of my background, I am very active in ASHRAE as well as APPA. I'm on the 90.1 standard committee. I'm also on technical committees for the education facilities. And we had a group that was a subgroup of the epidemiology task group of ASHRAE. And so they worked on the education facilities. Mainly they focused on K through 12, but they did cross over into a lot of areas of higher ed. Also on TC, Technical Committee 7.3, which is Maintenance of Operations, and the Multidisciplinary Task Group of Effective Building Operations. So you can kind of see the theme. I really want to kind of be around our building, the sciences of our building relative to ASHRAE's work and efforts in making our good, healthy, safe, and energy efficient buildings. So I want to kind of tag on to where ASHRAE is on this topic. They updated their COVID statement in April of this year, and the statement, it was a slight modification, so I'm going to read it. Airborne transmission of SARS-CoV-2 is significant and should be controlled. So the significant came in and would replace likely. So I think the research has shown, and Linda has said this, that the transmission from person to person in close contact is the most likely way from an airborne standpoint, and that the fomite transmission on surfaces is less likely. So the percent, if you're around a person who's infected and you're not masked and you're talking, there's a higher percentage of likelihood that it's going to be transmitted through airborne than it is from contact, is some of the current research. So I'm going to focus on really the HVAC side. Of course, that's our topic today. So in existing buildings, what should be done? I really want to focus on kind of the things that I see as a professional, that these are your priorities, and it really complements what Aaron has already said and showed in his data models. And I'm a data guy too. I love the data-driven type of decisions. But first and foremost, I think us as facilities managers and operators and owners, we need to make sure our HVAC systems are operating properly. There's nothing you can do about mitigating any type of risk, whether it's a virus or mold or other type of pathogens, if your HVAC systems is operating poorly. So you need to do a retro commissioning to these assets to make sure they're operating at least to design standards. And that includes going through a DDC system, your building automation system, make sure that the schedules are operating properly, that the actuators are working, and control loops are tuned, not modulating or hunting, looking for how to control temperature or other variables. You mentioned, Aaron mentioned the fault detection, you know, the high percentage that are found in fault. I think we can say that probably is universal, you know, making sure that you acknowledge and address those faults. Some of them are critical faults, some of them are less critical. You need to prioritize and take care of those critical ones, and make sure that your sensors are operating and calibrated and operating properly. Probably the biggest thing we're going to see in the operations for HVAC systems, you're going to see things operating in hand instead of operating in auto. And when that happens, you're going to have all kinds of failures of the system or potential challenges with these systems. So those need to be returned back and operating properly relative to the automation controls. Now, not all HVAC systems have DDC systems or automation. They may be just tied to a thermostat and controlling the air handler or rooftop unit, or a split system, almost a conventional model of like what you would see in your home, or it may be on pneumatics, which is on all of our campuses that are of any age where we haven't got the DDC fully proliferated. It still applies that you retro commission and make sure those are operating correctly as well. That's your first step, and I think that's your most important thing you need to do first with your maintenance and operations staff. If you have to outsource that, do it, but you're going to get better gains by insourcing that and defining people, no matter how short-staffed you are, to go and correct these items. Because then they learn some of the nuances about your systems, your equipment, your assets, and make sure that they operate at optimal operational conditions continuously, instead of doing a one-shot fixing it and retro commissioning. You're going to do more of a continuous commissioning with your maintenance staff. So you need to also, with your preventive maintenance or your proactive maintenance programs, make sure that these assets are clean, your coils are clean, your filters have been changed on a regular basis, and that can vary from air handler to air handler. Your condensate drains are draining properly. If it's a refrigerant-based system, make sure that all that is up to its correct pressures and operating conditions. If it's chilled water with heating water, make sure that the water flows are correct. And then probably more importantly, especially relative to outside air or segregation, make sure your dampers are working properly, because if you think you're ventilating and your dampers are not opening, then you're giving a false sense of security and you're not meeting the 62 standard for ventilation. I think you should always prioritize your retro commissioning efforts, because we all have limited resources. We're strapped for staff and money, but make sure you prioritize that to your building occupancy density or duration of occupancy. One thing that is fairly clear with the data is that when people are exposed to COVID, there's a factor of not just close proximity, but the time duration that you're exposed to somebody who is offshedding this virus. So those systems, those buildings where people congregate for longer periods of time should be your higher priority, where you look to make sure these HVAC systems are operating properly, especially your housing units. Your dorms are going to congregate there, your libraries, your student common areas, your dining facilities, and also your athletic facilities. We know athletic facilities on most campuses are operating sometimes 18 hours a day because of students doing training and the way the sporting events go. So don't overlook those. Kind of in my climate zone, I'm in the Mid-South, humidity is a big issue for us. So we're fixing to get into June. We're going to start hitting dew points in the excess of 70 degrees, and it will stay between 70 and 80 degrees dew point until probably mid-September, early October. So people along the coast, East Coast, the Southern Coast, Dave's going to speak here. He knows all about humidity in Florida. And, but the Western climate zones, it's a reverse problem. The reason why humidity is important to monitor in our area is primarily for mold propagation, but from a humidity standpoint, we find that the virus, in most viruses, they can, when it's offshedded in droplets, it stays suspended in the air with low humidities. So if you are in a climate zone where you have low humidity almost year round, or at least in the wintertime for most of us in continental US, you need to monitor that. And if you have humidification systems, you need to make sure they're working properly. And that's a big ask, because we know humidification systems are very challenging to make sure they operate properly consistently. Hospitals have to do this for their surgical areas, school K through 12 schools and universities. A lot of time we deactivate our humidification systems because they are such a maintenance burden for us to make sure they're operating properly. But we do recommend, ASHRAE recommends, to maintain your space humidity between 40 and 60% to help minimize when the virus is aerosolized into the air. At lower humidities, it stays suspended longer and it can survive longer. But we've known that even pre-COVID with flus and other viruses that transmit better in low humidity spaces. Priority 2 is something that ASHRAE speaks about, is that if you, to make sure that you can, relative to your HVAC system and strategies to mitigate on our campuses, is source control at the space and dilution. Aaron talked a little bit about ventilation, and I'm going to talk a little about the source control. The best mitigation practice for existing buildings is to make sure that you're doing occupancy screening, wearing masks, the physical distancing, and minimize exposure duration time. And Linda spoke to that. So those we know work, and there's plenty of data now that shows that works really well. So, and also when you're in a space where HVAC can be a contributing factor for the viral spread, is mainly the air currents in the space. So there's the classic early example or study about the Wuhan restaurant, where there was an occupant the person that came in with the virus and it spread to others, but it was a mini split system that was not tied to a central heating air, and the air current spread it across the room, and there was a duration time that the other folks were exposed. So there was those two factors that really contributed to that. There's also a study about a call center in South Korea that had similar type of challenges and didn't have the dilution with fresh air. So it was air currents, not so much the central HVAC. Those are items that are really driven by occupant behavior and policies of the of the institution or an organization. So the other way that we can really kind of mitigate the source control is the dilution with outside air. So we've talked a little bit about that, and Aaron spoke to it in ventilating, so I won't spend a whole lot of time, but there's a lot of research out there that's coming out, it's emerging, that's saying when people wear masks, the ventilation rate that is standard to 60.1 is sufficient, about 1 air change per hour, and we don't see viral spread any more than if you do the 3 to 5 air changes per hour. So 1 air change per hour works if the occupants are wearing masks. When they take the mask off, sometimes you do not get the same impact of the lower spread rate in this emerging research topic until you get up to about 3 to 5 air changes per hour. So if we have in your region, your zone, your campus, you have an outbreak, I think it's advisable that if we can't overventilate the space or adequately ventilate the space to kind of mitigate and dilute the virus, then people do need to wear a mask and do the standard ventilation. So that's the kind of the takeaway from the preliminary takeaway from that research. In-room purifiers, Aaron spoke to that and show a graph, and I'm going to be supportive of that. They are very effective when placed near the viral source or in small rooms or non-ventilated or minimally ventilated spaces. So he showed the graph that showed the data that validates that. Very quickly, priority 3, HVAC enhancements that I think is important. There is a recommendation by ASHRAE to go to MERV 13. For existing buildings, most of your air handlers do not have a filter frame mechanism that is MERV 13 compatible. So what you're going to see, and that probably is part of the reason why Aaron's graph showed that there's not much difference between a MERV 8 and 13, it could be bypassing around the filters in that frame in existing air handlers. I am supportive of MERV 13 for new construction and new design for indoor air quality overall, but it may or may not be an effective measure for mitigating viruses. So just other technologies that you can look in your HVAC air handlers. A UV light is something that I'm very supportive of, but I think it needs to be looked at prudently and make sure that you apply it case by case. It's a very expensive upfront cost. It may not be for one air handler, but if you're a larger campus, several million square feet, and you multiply it out, it's going to be a very large capital expense. Not only that, it's a recurring expense where you have to change the lamps generally about once a year. So about 8,000 hours is what most UV lamps operate on. But it does work well, but it needs to be installed properly. It needs to be designed properly for your air handler. There's not really an off-the-shelf solution for most air handlers that you buy and you install yourself. I would say the best location is downstream from an air handler, from the chill water coil or the cooling coil, and because it works really, really well on wet surfaces or damp surfaces, the coils, and that's where it would capture viruses or pathogens, and the UV light would be exposed to it for a long enough time and have the proximity and the duration that it would kill the virus or kill the other pathogens. When it's passing through an airstream, it may damage the virus, it may not damage the virus if it's passing it at 300 feet per minute and it's on the other side of the ductwork. So you got to be very careful about UV light. It needs time, intensity, and time duration and proximity. So those are the items that are important with UV light. Other technologies, I know a lot of buzz is about bipolar ionization. There's just not a lot of research out there relative to HVAC systems and viruses, but there's research that's emerging. There's some research that says that technology may actually create unintended consequences with off-gassing as the ions react with certain products or certain materials. One that I'm looking at is a hydroxyl ionization. It basically creates a hydrogen peroxide molecules that's got a charge, and then it will attach to viruses and other pathogens, and it does continuous kill. Those are the type of technologies, though, that are very expensive. So again, you have to be very prudent. So relative to your HVAC, the short answer is, if you're doing new systems, I think you should consider MERV 13 filtration, some of these enhancements like UV light that's designed into your system. But if you've got an existing system and you just want to throw MERV 13 in, I don't think it's going to work. And I think Aaron's data shows that relative to COVID. And Linda said this as well, there's not any documented cases where central HVAC systems has been a contributing factor to the spread of the virus. So now small mini splits blowing currents across the room, that's a different story. Lander, back to you.
Dave, that was excellent as always, and you connected some dots here between Linda and Aaron, and I know that they're both pleased as well. So there we go. We will have lots of questions that are already coming in. And I think the nice thing here, Dave, and now Dave, is that we're going to connect some dots to what it is we need to be doing with respect to our communications. So let me introduce Dave Irvin. He is our Associate Vice President for Facilities at Florida State University and APPA President-elect. Dave is responsible for overseeing the entirety of FSU's campus facilities planning and management infrastructure portfolio across all 5 campuses. He has more than 40 years of exceptional experience in university facilities and maintenance in 6 states, and previously led facilities teams at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, the University of Houston and its university system, University of Nebraska, Omaha, and Emporia State University. Dave also served as a Kappa and Serapa region board member and past Texas and Tennessee APPA chapter president. Dave has a bachelor's degree in architectural studies from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He has also pursued graduate work in architecture, planning, and design at Oxford University in England, and architecture, construction engineering, and planning at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Dave, please speak to proactively managing the communication aspects.
Well, thank you, Lander. I'm humbled by the talent that preceded me, and it's really amazing the kind of resources APPA can bring, whether it's Linda and her experience with APIC, David with his hands-on experience, his ASHRAE knowledge, or Aaron and the knowledge that he's bringing as one of our key business partners. Really, APPA is the only place that has that kind of talent and has those kind of answers. And it's really been important, as we all know, during this pandemic. We've always relied on that, but now we've been able to take that information and apply it and be on the cutting edge of what we need to do. What that has meant is that we've been at the forefront of all of these discussions across our campus. Certainly our teams have been here since day one. They never were able to go away. They had to be on the front lines. And it's put us in not just at the table, it's put us leading the discussion about what we need to do in terms of COVID and what we need to do in terms of keeping our buildings safe. Well, now we're trying to look at how do we transition? What's the post-COVID environment look like? And I would suggest that we don't want to relinquish that position. We still have more information. We heard a lot of it on the call already today that is cutting edge that many of our colleagues don't have yet. We want to be in the position to give that information and to continue to lead our campus. Aaron mentioned that he's been involved in this for over 8 years in terms of indoor air quality and healthy, safe buildings, healthy, smart buildings. Even post-COVID, those things are going to be very critical, whether it's COVID or mold, indoor air quality, all the various parameters. They now have an urgency and a campus that is going to be focusing on those more than ever before. So what I would suggest is we need to take advantage of that. And I'll relay an example that happened just the other day. I was in a conversation with a number of facilities heads from a number of universities, and the topic came up, what are you going to be doing in the fall in terms of COVID, in terms of some of these mitigation strategies? And the majority of the people on the call said, well, they were going to quit doing that. They weren't going to do any enhanced cleaning. They weren't going to to change. They weren't going to do anything more in terms of venting and all those kinds of things. They were going to go back to what they were doing in 2019 because COVID was over. And so there was no need to do that anymore. And I was kind of quizzical about that. And I said, are you having that conversation with your campus? Do they know why you're changing? Is it based on data? Is it based on some of the great facts that David and Aaron and Linda have given us? No, we just don't need to do it anymore. I would suggest that's a recipe for failure. There may be very well things that we need to change, mitigations and measures that we took when we knew less about COVID that aren't needed anymore, but that needs to be a conversation that we lead and we have with our colleagues and our partners across campus. And I would suggest that while there may be some of those things that we don't need to do as much, and some of those were suggested in the calls this afternoon, there are other things that are still part of being a healthy, smart building that we need to lean in on. We need to use the experience and the expertise and the comfort level that our campus has with us to mold that discussion so that facilities is not seen as a cost or a service, but facilities is seen as critical to the mission of what we do. We have incredible abilities. I'm not going to try to get into the specifics. You can relate to these town halls. Certainly go to the APPA 365 and other resources. We're going to need to figure out how to engage our campus and how to have that communication on a lot of different levels. There'll be some engineers and some of our faculty who will want this kind of detail, who will want the kind of things we heard this afternoon. And we need to be prepared to give them that. We need to be prepared to have that on our websites, to have fact sheets and things that we're giving to them when they come. There will be others who this is not their thing. They just want to make sure that they're safe and they want to know that we're doing the right thing. And so for those folks, the conversation will need to be different. It will need to be more broadly based in terms of what we're doing, how we're doing it, and how we will continue to make sure that our campus is safe and why we are so critical to that discussion and to our mission. Let me give an example. It may seem a little bit off the wall, but if you go into a grocery store now, we're a week before Memorial Day, and you look at the end of each aisle, you're likely to see things like, charcoal and grilling tools, or maybe in another area you'll see hamburgers and hot dogs and hamburger buns, chips and dips, because the grocery store knows that we're all thinking about Memorial Day and those picnics and those outdoor gatherings. And so they put those front and center so that we know that they have them and we're ready to buy those, to engage with them. They've always had those kind of things. They always sell hot dogs and hamburgers and chips and dips. They put them at the end because this time of year, that's what's on people's mind. But when our campus comes back, many of whom haven't been back since March, how safe their buildings are, how healthy their buildings are, is going to be front and center on every one of their minds, whether it's a student, a parent, a faculty member, or just our general campus community. So I would suggest that we don't go back to what we did in 2019. We lean in on that. And so here at Florida State, for instance, we are starting this summer, and we're going to unveil it at the start of fall semester, a healthy building team. And let me quickly add, this is not a whole lot of new people. This is taking people from environmental health, people that work on mold, that work on asbestos, that do retro commissioning, all the parts and pieces that we do to make sure our buildings are safe, coloring that and influencing that with the information that we're getting from great experts like we're here today. And we're putting that front and center. We're going to focus that on our website. We're going to focus that in social media. We're going to have lots of rollout and PR about that so that when folks come back, they know that we're thinking about that. It's that example of the grocery store and what's at the end of the aisle. We've always done this. Now we know even more about how to do it, and we're going to make sure our campus understands that we're the experts. We're the ones that lead that conversation, and we are an indispensable partner. And as a really important benefit to that, it also focuses attention on our fantastic teams who have been here through all of this, who have done yeoman's work, who know buildings, who know how to make things work, it gives them the publicity and the attention and the spotlight that they deserve. I'm not going to try to get into the technical sorts of things. The other panelists have covered that really well. I'd just like to suggest that we take that information and think about how we communicate that and package it in a way that puts it front and center so our campus knows what we're doing and appreciates what we bring to the table. Lander, with that, I'll turn it back, and I know we have a lot of questions and a lot of folks that want to talk about a lot of different things.
We do. We have a ton of questions, and I'm super stoked about the kinds of questions that people have. They're both technical, and there's some comments too that we can all respond to. So I'm going to start with it's a question about in-room HEPA filters, and so maybe Aaron, I could get you to consider that along with Dave Handwork. Certainly, Linda, you are free to dive into this, but my colleague says when an in-room HEPA filter is discussed, is that a filter that is recirculating room air through the filter or a filter on the supply to the room itself? That's where they're coming from. Any suggestions, Aaron?
The former. So your supply air distribution will not produce enough pressure to get air at any kind of appreciable volume through a HEPA filter. HEPA filters need to be designed for, at the air handling unit level, sort of from the start. There are some ducted HEPA filter solutions that have come out recently in response to this. Inverid has an interesting product there that's like 500 CFM above ceiling ducted HEPA filter solution, but it's not connected to your central system. So when we're talking about HEPA, we're talking about a unit mounted within the space, standalone. The key there, and Dave Handwork mentioned this, is sizing and design. With a HEPA filter, to get a really appreciable effect, you actually need a decent air change per hour rate for that unit, right? So it itself needs to be doing something like over 4 air changes an hour in order for you to get an effect across the whole space that is meaningful for transmission risk. So they do need to be sized appropriately. Little air cleaners, that like personal ones, they have a term called CADR, clean air delivery rate, which is sort of the filter efficiency times the flow rate through the thing. What you will find if you look at the spec on a lot of those things is the CADR is not very high, even if the filter efficiency is high, right? You need to actually get a lot of air flowing through them to make it effective.
Very good. Dave, did you want to add to that, or you feel pretty good about that response?
Yeah, I feel good. What I would say is I know that on a campus, there's a lot of requests that the university provide that for classrooms and offices. And the reality is to get the right ones that are sized for rooms. And some of them, you just can't get one big enough for a large space. So it's not really practical, even if you buy several and you put it around the room. But the good ones and the ones that Aaron talked about that are really effective, they're expensive. And so it creates a budget challenge. And I do acknowledge that they are very effective on change, if it does size right for the room, to making sure the room is better as far as relative to pathogens in the room. But if it's in a room that is, the source is on the other side of the room and of a shedding virus and the filters on the opposite side of the room, it's not going to provide the same level of effectiveness as far as like cleaning that space. So they're really, really good when they're adjacent to sources and for rooms that may or may not have the right air changes for fresh air to dilute it. And K through 12 classrooms, I think I would be an advocate for that for the smaller classrooms.
That's great. And I think that may tie to the next question that we had gotten in this around the changing from MERV 8 to MERV 13 filters. Are you saying that doesn't reduce the risk of COVID significantly, but making sure that you have greater than 3 air changes per hour does? Dave Handwork, I think that you and Aaron both talked about that and in this response. So yay or nay on that. And then the following one is, and Aaron, you might discuss it just a little further, is that the air testing we need to do, is that the air testing, or should we be testing for CO2 levels? So you might give a little more. So Dave, on the MERV 8 to MERV 13, I think you were talking a fair amount about that and when to use, when not, what you can do or can't do. So you feel pretty good about where we are with respect to that response?
I do. I think it's one of those it depends answers. I really think for throwing a MERV 13 into an air handler that's not designed for a MERV 13 is a waste of money. And it does not effectively do what you really want to attempt to do as far as filter things. And again, there's really no evidence that a central air system, that the viruses go through the coils and through any filters and gets past that and gets redistributed into the space in a way that it propagates the virus. It gets diluted for one thing, but it's going to hit so many obstacles that it's just, I think filtration is important, but you need to do it for the right reasons and not for as a knee-jerk reaction.
Very good. Aaron, you want to talk about the CO2 piece?
Yeah, I would just add to that by saying I think a useful model here is to think about the location of the risk. So if you think of a spectrum of risk for transmitting a virus, the worst thing that can happen is you're standing across from somebody and they sneeze in your face. There is no amount of ventilation that you are going to put into a building that is going to prevent, that is going to make that a less risky scenario. But then if you think about a gigantic building served by one air handling unit and you're in a room on another floor that's far away from the person that's sneezing in a room, that is a very, very different scenario. For a measurable concentration of pathogen to actually make it into your body from that emission in that other part of the floor is, I think, where David is saying there's just very, very, there's increasing evidence that it doesn't happen beyond the fact that there's no evidence that it does happen.
Mm-hmm.
As far as CO2, there's two things I'm recommending you could do. One of them is not new, and that is measure CO2. The technology to do that has advanced and the cost has come down significantly. So if you're interested in doing this, buy yourself a reset commercial grade air quality monitor. That's my advice for a specification, and you can look those up at the Reset Standard website, reset.build. And they have a specification, or actually a certification, for commercial grade monitors. They're not like $10,000 lab monitors or cheap personal monitors. They're kind of in the middle and are conformed to a very high data quality. CO2, measuring that is, if you can measure one thing, it is generally the best thing you measure. One thing that it won't do, one interesting caveat, is the HEPA filters. So if you're measuring CO2 in a room, you pack it full of people, CO2 is going to spike if you shut the door. But if you have a whole bunch of HEPA filtration in that room, the risk can actually come down. So it's not perfect, but it is a good proxy in most situations. The testing I'm talking about is different, and it is relatively new. What Safe Traces is doing with that is, there's really, it's patented. There's no one else doing it, which is why I even mentioned their name. I try to be non-commercial, but they're the only place you can go for this. And it is a liquid aerosol testing product to actually simulate a release by an infected person in a space. And so it's interesting and novel. Have a look. If anyone's interested, I can, add more detail to that.
Okay, that's great. And Linda, anytime you may find this will be an important conversation for you to weigh in, having been on the healthcare side and in at ASHI too. You bring an incredible level of experience to this. So I have a follow-on to this, and it really is that the sort of a statement about if increased filtration at the air handler doesn't reduce concentrations of infectious particles, because they don't make it to the air handler, and that's what we're hearing. The focus should be on increasing airflow rates, not necessarily increasing outside airflow rates. Could the three of you comment on that? I think, Linda, you want to comment on that, or you want to throw the ball to Dave or Aaron?
Well, I'll start us. I would say that both David and Aaron have made really good points that you can do a lot around your air handling system in terms of filtration or dilution. But if you've got someone who comes to work sick or is in the space and is in proximity to other people, essentially you can have a lot of environmental controls and that transmission can still occur. One thing that is rather nice, though, if you do have objective data, such as the CO2, and this is to Dave Irwin's point, is that if you want to demonstrate your culture or commitment to the safety of your building, or the performance of your building, or from an epidemiologic standpoint, take the building out of the equation to figure out how is this getting transmitted. Sometimes that data is helpful in that regard. So, it just gives you one more piece of evidence. Well, the building is performing, or the building may not be performing, or in fact, people are just not being compliant with measures that are in place.
Okay, that's good. Thank you so much. And it really does connect the dots back to what Dave Irvin was talking about in order to get your hands around this and ensure that you have both the data to make a data-driven decision, but you are proactively communicating it. That's great. I'm going to push to the HEPA filters. Dave Handwork on HEPA filters, because they are expensive to replace. Is it advisable to have the filter bank large enough for pre-filters? Because they further said everyone seems to have leftover MERV 8s and they are cheap. Of course, the assumption here is that the air handling unit can handle the pressure drop in cooling and heating modes with both types of filters installed. What's your sense of that in terms of the filter bank large enough for pre-filters?
Sorry, I was muted there for a second, but yeah, I think it's one of those depends answers. I think if you're pulling outside air in, absolutely, but I don't think usually you're having HEPA, unless you got like a clean room or a lab, that you're going to have HEPA on the outside air unit. But MERV 13 is at the very low end, the entry level as far as the HEPA class. But and by the way, I need to make a comment around MERV 13. That is the one of the requirements for a LEED certified building now. So, and that's done mainly for filtering the type of contaminants that could be off-gassing or other type of contaminants or pathogens in the space. And so I don't know if I can clearly answer that correctly. I just think it just depends that what you're trying to filter. If it's just standard recirculated office or classroom air, I would not put a pre-filter on there. I think that you're going to change those just as often as you do the HEPA filters. And I think it's better to have like with your DDC system, have the type of instrumentation and sensors in there to demand changes of your filters. So, using Aaron's, topic of doing data-driven decisions, we'll have the system have either algorithms in there or some type of smart logic that says, okay, don't change the filter every 6 months, only change it on demand. So you may not get the pressure drop for 2 years, or maybe it's 2 months. So just change it whenever, and if it's every 2 months, then you got a particulate problem. You don't have a filter problem. You got a particulate problem. You need to figure out what's causing that.
Very good. So, follow on that one as a combination. If a person's unit has pre-filter MERV 8s and main filter MERV 13, is that combination okay?
I used to, in my former life, work for Camfield FAR, and so I'm not a filter expert, but typically what you see on a pre-filter is a very low MERV rating. So you're going to see something like a MERV 4 or 6. You're not going to see anything like an 8. So it's not a very high efficiency filter. Those pre-filters are meant to capture the big dust particles and even debris, like leaves or other type of debris. They're not intended to capture any type of small particles. So I would say that you're going to have a lower MERV rating as a pre-filter. And again, those situations are unique and rare. I would not do that in a standard operating type of educational or commercial space.
Okay, very good. And someone did ask, as we continue to follow this series of questions, this path, how often should I change the MERV 13s if they have them? Does it depend back on the data?
Well, every filter manufacturer is going to have what they call a pressure drop curve. So filters are actually the least efficient that they'll ever be when they're brand new. And so they build up a cake, and so that increases their efficiency. So a lot of times we change our filters too soon. We don't let it build up that cake. And that cake the efficiency will peak with a pressure drop, and then it declines as far as their efficiency. That's really the right answer, like when to replace the filter. But a lot of our air handlers does not have the pressure drop sensors to do that sophisticated type of analysis of like when is the right time to replace it. But that is something that we need now as part of a post-COVID to be really proactive and really prudent with our changing our filters relative to our limited budgets.
Very good. Okay, Dave Irvin, I'm over to you, and I'll come back to you folks. But Dave, you've got a fun one from Go Vols, all right? They are not letting go of you, buddy. Said, since you've transitioned between institutions during COVID, can you speak to any particular best practices that you noticed that might not stand out to others? I think you were doing that in some of your remarks, but I also think Linda might be able to help us there, because Linda, I'll try not to throw you a curveball in a second, but I want to talk about what we need to be thinking since we have some new realities to deal with. Dave, you want to help us out there?
Well, a lot of the practices between Tennessee and Florida State were similar because of APPA and the knowledge base. The thing that I found that was most effective here, which is somewhat related, but not exactly, is sort of the enhanced cleaning. And I know that was what we were looking at early on when we had very little data on COVID. We've understand now that probably isn't the best COVID measure, but what we found is that that helps a lot in other ways, and it puts our people front and center, so that as those questions arise, it's sort of that interaction with our campus. So we found that in the buildings where we weren't doing that, we had a lot more questions, a lot more complaints, a lot more folks that just didn't know what was going on. And where we were doing that enhanced cleaning, and we had our frontline custodians and maintenance people sort of front and center, even if that wasn't necessarily what we now know is the best thing for COVID, it was helping in a lot of other ways as well. So I'd say that was probably the best practice, and we had backed off a little bit in that in some buildings. We've now reconfigured how we're doing things. We're not doing offices as much. We're keeping people front and center in those high touch public areas because of all those auxiliary benefits. Not just COVID, but sort of the whole healthy building scenario.
Very good. And I think to one person's question or comment at one point, in June, we're going to talk more about fall reopening, changing reopening strategies. How are we thinking about that in even more detail? And so that's going to happen. But Linda, since I have you on this, someone was asking, what are the most effective means to communicate actions taken and results achieved? Because we have had, we are dealing with the sort of execution of and implementation of new layers of guidance from federal, state, and local authorities. So maybe you can help us think about how we sort of manage through that conflict and some thoughts on where we're headed here.
I think we've all experienced the sense of having to work through very fast changing guidelines, and not only having to absorb that and understand what that might imply for different sectors of specialty, but then communicate that out. What does that look like in terms of actually operationalizing something, cleaning the train while it's going by? So certainly as we move into the fall, again, our best weapon is going to be vaccination, and I would see all sectors of our communities across the country, across the world, hopefully, being able to promote vaccination. But in terms of building spaces, I think that being able to, I think Dave Irwin's points are so important that some of the basic practices, such as we all should have maybe been cleaning our hands a little bit more. all along, and to be able to highlight and show, that we make that easy now in our building spaces, or the fact that, the menus in a restaurant might get wiped off when they might not have ever gotten wiped off, so just very basic things that we're now doing in our communities and our spaces that will help us during flu season, cold season. May or may not be a big impact during COVID, but they are just really good practices. And again, not that we have to go overboard with them, but reinforce them as good basic practices. One of the things that I hope becomes part of our culture, in the United States, we've never really embraced masking, but I think if you are someone who is undergoing chemotherapy or you're sick in some way, it should be okay to be able to wear a mask. And we've always seen that as a very odd thing, but I think for someone's own individual protection, or if you just have to go out and you've got flu or a cold, I think it's a great thing to be able to, practice that respiratory hygiene by wearing a mask. And I hope that maybe we will start thinking in that way moving forward.
I love that comment. And Linda, I'm going to ask you something. It's totally just anecdotal from me, and that is that it seems as though we did better this year because we were very engaged in COVID for all the right reasons, but did way better in terms of influenza, the flu. And part of it seems to be because of the hand hygiene, the masking, social distancing, these kinds of things really sort of demonstrated what you just said. Am I right about that? Because that is a good case for let's reduce flu overall. And I mean, is that a good statement to make?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it was seen across the country, and it was striking how negligible the flu season was this year. Mm-hmm. So I think we do see that just that small amount of effort. Not that it was a small amount of effort. I mean, we were all like, oh my gosh, when am I going to be able to have a barbecue with my friends again? But, but being able to keep our hands cleaner and to keep our droplets to ourselves, just those two simple measures really do make a difference. Now, having said that, do know that if you've got a lot of people congregated in a space, and if there are a number of people in that space that are ill, and there's not good source control, your environment is going to be a critical factor in controlling the safety. So to be able to say, to Dave Handwork's point, part of our culture here is that we maintain our buildings. We make sure that they're performing at the level that they're designed. And that is in part not only for performance, but for safety. And to be able to highlight that, I think is great.
That's really excellent. I think that's starting to give us elements of a business case for why we continue to do some of the things that we had implemented, because that is going to get complicated when we bring everyone back. And I think all institutions are pushing for full enrollment. I want all students back as at all possible to really maximize the revenue side of this too. So it does come with its set of consequences. Those are great statements. Aaron, I want to go back to you on a different question that an individual wanted to get a little more information on. He says the overall reduction of airborne pathogens over time graph that you showed using different MERV rated filters and room HEPA filters. They said this information will be very helpful to justify the use of MERV 18s for existing units rather than the MERV 13s. Can you speak to that, and maybe some of the sourcing might help, because I know these folks on the call are trying to get their business cases together to think through what they need to be doing. Can you help us on that side?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that may be the wrong conclusion from that study, because the indication is that there was a sort of negligible, and look, this, as David Handwork has pointed out, this is on a case-by-case basis, but that was a central rooftop unit on a training room with essentially a classroom. It's a big room. It's just shy of 10,000 square feet. It's 100 seats, right? It's about 90 by 90 feet square. So it's a big space relatively high open ceiling, big air volume, rooftop units serving that part of the building. And when they did the in-room HEPA filters, I think there was 4, if I remember correctly, that they located around the room. So there's a lot, right? A lot of air volume, and there was some trade-offs there with sound levels. It wasn't perfect. But what the data indicated is that the MERV level in the air handling unit actually had negligible effect. And that's not to say if you went from 13 to 18, maybe it would have an effect. Well, I'll tell you though, that is a major air handling unit upgrade in most situations in order to go from 8 to 18. I mean, you're basically going to a HEPA filter on a fan that is likely not sized. So that's probably a motor upgrade. Certainly, it's, a gearing drivetrain upgrade at minimum there. And there's an energy penalty to doing that too. So I think what I would recommend is test the situation and see if it is worth doing a filter upgrade. See how much actually comes back to your air handling unit. The tests are relatively inexpensive before you make that decision to sort of do that.
Okay, very good. And Dave, a little bit a different twist here. We're looking for the documented some sources, and the person said, can you repeat something you said along the lines of there have not been any documented instances of building ventilation systems being responsible for the transmission of COVID? Can you cite a source where they could refer to, because this really will help support that?
So my best source for people to go to, we had Steve Taylor from Taylor Engineering on one of our earlier calls earlier this year. And Steve is one of the giants out there that looks at things from a very engineering and scientific point of view. And on his website, he has aggregated a lot of research papers, and they summarized some of the findings from all these research papers. And that's where he's quoting. They've looked, they can't find anything that shows substantiated evidence of a central HVAC system contributing to the spread of COVID. So that's really kind of the findings of that. So they can go to taylorengineering.com or just search on Google Steve Taylor Engineering, and there's good content on his website, but it has all those links to those research papers and topics.
That's great. And I thought the same. I did visit their site recently, and I thought there was some really, really good information there. So Taylor Engineering, that's great. And they really have done a great job of summarizing these things and giving you the detail for the data and science. So early on, we shut down hair dryers, they said, and moved back to paper towels. There seems to be no evidence that hand dryers spread the virus. Are any of you on this call doing that? What do you think about that? And what is the perception associated? I think sometimes it's about managing the perception. So Dave Irvin, since you knew I was going to go there when I said that.
Yeah, I think it is a perception issue. I think if we just unilaterally went to air dryers, we'd have an outcry on the campus. So I think it's probably a way we can move, but I think this is a really good example of where we're going to have a lot of communication and a lot of discussion with our campus partners, helping them understand the data, helping them understand what the research has evolved to, because right now there is a perception that those are unsafe, that only paper towels is the way we need to go. And I know that's not true, but we've got a lot of education and communication to do if we're going to make that change.
Yeah, and I think that is at the heart of a lot of this with new relaxed masking and not knowing who is or who isn't, and what are you going to do in your classrooms, et cetera. So there's a lot of work we're going to need to do this summer to get our hands around how to manage this and how to communicate it, what are going to be our experiences. We'll be doing a survey out to members about how they're going to consider changes in those strategies, and then a follow-on town hall so we can try to help people early on in the summer manage where they're going to go. I'm going to go, we're getting close to the end. There are a couple things. Aaron, you may be able to help us. What is the normal range for indoor CO2 levels in office buildings? And then it says, and at what ppm concentration should be cause for concern? Do you know that?
Well, concern is a term that doesn't have a definition. So there's a wide interpretation here. What I will say is I think ASHRAE is wrong on this. I think their CO2 levels in 62.1 are too high. So if you want a lot of good evidence on where they should be, I would suggest to read this book by Joseph Allen and John Mackenber. John Mackenber was my professor at Harvard Business School. That is a fantastic book that will talk a lot about why it should be lower than what ASHRAE says. I would say the best sort of standard definition for this comes from the reset standard that I mentioned earlier when I was talking. 100% performance-based standard for IAQ. They set a target in commercial buildings at the air handling unit level of, I believe, 800 parts per million. And then for individual spaces, you have to give it a bit more leeway because it spikes up and it's 1,000, but there is a high performance certification you can get designation that is 600. That's tough to do, but it is possible to do. But it's, generally speaking, you're going to want to try to target under 1,000 parts per million in an occupied space if you can, in order to maximize cognitive function. And I would imagine that in your institutions, that is a primary objective.
Very good. I'm going to go to a sort of a final question. Dave Hamwork, you may want to chime in, but any of you, please, because we have a couple of questions. One is there a move towards maximizing use of natural ventilation, low or no HVAC in the shoulder seasons where buildings have fans and windows in place? That's an interesting one as it relates to humidity levels depending on geography. Am I right there, Dave Hamwork?
Absolutely. I think that you don't want to be in Dave Irwin in the Panhandle, Florida, and have natural ventilation year round, because you're going to have other challenges. But if you're in north central Iowa or Minnesota, I think there's times of year that natural ventilation is definitely appropriate, and you should be doing that. And when we look at high performance buildings from a standpoint of sustainability and energy conservation, that is one of the base principles of design. When you can do natural ventilation, do that. And because it is really the best for you. We know that intuitively because they released some of the standards for HVAC distancing and masks outdoors before they did it indoors, did they not? So if you can bring the outdoors indoors from a standpoint of ventilation, you're going to make your space generally healthier. Now, I'll qualify that. If you're next to an industrial plant that's putting off a lot of gases, that's not good either. So it's got to be a case by case.
Very good. I had a sneaking suspicion you were going to tell me that. I do have one last one here. I'm going to try to squish it in, and it's there are many legacy buildings that have created space with little or no ventilation. We're all aware of those. For those spaces, are you allowing occupancy this fall or providing a dedicated local air scrubber for each space? As that does get complicated, and I think we had talked about either not using some rooms because of those issues. Any of you want to chime in on that, including Linda? What do we do there? And then I'll go to close.
I would say from a practical safety standpoint, because obviously those buildings were in use before COVID. And with COVID, again, the transmission is going to primarily be if someone's infectious. And I realize there's been a lot of talk about asymptomatic spread, but truly the majority of what we saw has some degree of symptoms. So I would say for buildings like that, optimize them to the degree that you can based on how they're designed, and then have people continue with with the practices that have been recommended. A1 being to get vaccinated. And whether it's flu season, cold season, or anything else, if you have any degree of symptoms, either don't come to work or wear a mask or try to practice reasonable hand hygiene and respiratory protection, no matter what building you go into.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'm going to run it to close here. So thank you, panel. Please take note of APPA's upcoming VFS, which is our Virtual Facility Summit, aka our annual meeting on July 20 to 22. We'll have some really great topics for you. Don't forget to download our app called APPA 365. Here's a slide showing other available resources from APPA and that we're going to run another town hall in mid-June, focusing on changing fall reopening strategies here. So as I close, the vaccines and the science behind them have led us to this point. So when you get that first hug from a friend, enjoy a meal out without a mask, and get to send your kids back to school, take a second to appreciate every single person that helped make these moments possible. A big thank you to our panel today, and thank you all for the opportunity to serve you. Have a good day and absolute great weekend. Thanks so much, everyone. Go get vaccinated.